This is the day that the Lord has made. We ought to rejoice and be exceedingly glad in it. Are you glad to be in the house of the Lord on today? Come on, let's give God great praise. Listen, let's thank God for these young people who have led us in worship in such a powerful and meaningful way. Once again, let me pause and give my level of respect and thanks to your warm and winsome pastor in the person of Reverend BRYAN Carter. Let's thank God for him. He knows so many preachers. Thank you, Pastor. And we are grateful that he has had time to get away and rest. And I know he thanks God for you for being faithful even in his absence. Even the preacher needs some rest. Amen. Look at somebody say, our pastor needs rest. Amen. And to his family and to all of you who have been so hospitable. Your church is in this summer song. I want to call your attention today to the 40th number of the song. Psalm 40. And I want to lift up the first stanza, verses 1 through 3, the first section of that song. When you have secured that scripture, signify by saying amen. Listen to how my Bible reads. I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me from the pit of destruction out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, and a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. I waited patiently for the Lord. I want to talk about what the Lord's helping your prayers. Faith for the waiting room. Faith for the waiting room. You may be seated. Church, waiting is one of the most undesirable things that we will be forced to do. Can we be honest this morning? Many of us, we simply don't like waiting. Consider with me the anxiety that accompanies waiting. Someone knows what it is to await a doctor's test to return. What's only a few days seems like months. Someone else knows what it is to be forced to sit in a car in Dallas traffic. You see your exit in view, but you are forced to wait because of congestion on the highway. Someone knows the anxiety that accompanies waiting for a physical or even more so an emotional wound to heal. The frustration of waiting is real when you have to wait on a fellow class person or a cohort to give you the necessary information that you need so you can complete a project. Some young person here, you are a recipient of a broken family, and you know what it is to have to wait on the other parent to come and pick you up, and sometimes they never show up. For some young adult here, you know what it is to wait. You had life all planned out in your journal, in your iPad, in your phone, in the note section. But by now you thought you would be married, you would have the degree, you'll be living in the house, you'll have a whole lot of money, but somehow things haven't quite worked out the way you wrote it out or typed it out in the note section of your phone, and you are forced to wait. Someone here this morning, you know waiting is serious and tedious business. And after all, we live in a society where we buy technology and we have all types of apps and we have hookups. Also, we are forced not to wait. Everything is sold on the premise of convenience, so we don't wait. Waiting is downright unattractive, and it gives many of us a lot of anxiety. No one really likes to wait. And I know we're in church, we go to Concord, you're in a life group, in a small group, and you are Christian, you came to church, and you are right with God, and oftentimes when life gets tough, your good church friend tells you, just wait on God. But somebody can testify, it's easy for someone else to say that when it's not their marriage, when it's not their money, when it's not their breakthrough. It's easy to tell somebody to wait on God when you are not forced to live in life's waiting room. Waiting is hard physically, it's hard spiritually, and it's downright hard emotionally. Waiting has a way of draining us physically and emotionally. Nobody likes to wait. Here in this text, Psalm 40 is categorized by scholar Walter Brueggemann as a psalm of thanksgiving. It is a psalm of new orientation where the psalmist has shifted from complaining to praising God. Psalm 39, Psalms 40 is a direct response to Psalm 39. And Psalm 39, David is pleading to God. He's pouring out his heart to God. Lord, how long am I going to have to go through this? How long will it seem like I've been forgotten? And in between Psalm 39, God switches the pages of the psalmist's life, and now he has gone from complaining to praising, and he says, God has rescued me, and I waited patiently on the Lord. Doesn't that sound like God, that God has a way of shifting us from complaining to praising? And that's not the believer being schizophrenic or bipolar. That's how God intervenes in our lives. There are times where we are pouring our heart out to God, and then when God has intervened, all we can do is lift our hands and say, God, it was nobody but you. Notice Psalms 40 is broken up into two categories. Look at it today. It is praise and lamenting. Wait a minute before you look at David as if he's bipolar or schizophrenic. Don't look too hard on David today. I think David, this psalm of praise and lamenting and complaining, it simply captures the totality of our lives. There are times where we are on top of the world, and then there are other times where it seems like the world is on top of us. There are times when it seems like the wind is at our back, that everything we touch turns to gold. And then there are times when it seems like everything is going wrong. But Psalms 40 in the first section gives us lyrics of hope when we are forced to live in life's waiting room. Listen to how the psalmist opens. David opens up with strong vibrato of voice and confidence of spirit. Listen to what he says. He says, I waited patiently on the Lord. Lean in, look at it. When you read this in the original language, it reads like this: I waited and I waited and I waited and I waited. Notice the emphasis is not on David's patience. The emphasis is on who David waited on. He says, I waited patiently on the Lord. David says, God is my only option. I've been in a tight place and only God can get me out. Who am I talking to at the 10 o'clock service that can testify? If God doesn't get you out, nobody can. If God doesn't save your marriage, nobody can. If God doesn't help you make it through school, nobody can. There are some things, if God doesn't do it, it just won't be done. Just shake somebody's hand and say, neighbor, if God doesn't do it, it just won't get done. David said, I waited patiently, not on somebody else, not on a lawyer, not on a politician, but I waited on God. But this is the tension in the text. If David is waiting, I'm quite sure that there were some other alternatives that were offered to him. Can we be honest today? when we are in between our now and our not yet, oftentimes other alternatives come for us to lean on. Somebody could have possibly said, David, I'll help you get out of this. I know you've been waiting a long time. Just come on and follow me. But David realized God was his only option. All I came to tell someone is this: you have to be mindful of whose hands you hold on to, because every hand that is extended to you is not an extension of the hand of God. And some people and things will lead you right out of God's will. David said, I waited patiently on the Lord. David tells us this simply this morning, that God has to be our main objective when we are forced to live in life's waiting room. Listen, can I tell you something? Life's waiting room is cold. It's sterile. It's unattractive. There's no background music in the waiting room. No DJ Khaled, no Beyonce, no Rembrandt paintings on the wall, no Posturepedic mattresses that are in life's waiting room. It's cold. You're all by yourself, and oftentimes all you have is your own conflicted emotions and thoughts. But David said this: when I waited on God, God did three things for me when I waited on him. And that's all. I want to give you three good things that God does for the believer when we wait on him. The first thing is this: God comes close to us. David opens up by telling us that when we are faithful to God, God is never aloof or nonchalant toward us. That's a good word for someone who's been waiting on God. God never overlooks your faithfulness. Has there ever been a time where you waited on God and it looks like God has gone on break in your life? The heavenly host has gone on furlough and no one left a return time. It seems like God is absent. But here this psalmist tells us, listen, while we are waiting on God, God is always faithful to his children. He says, I waited patiently on the Lord and he inclined his ear to me. Notice this paints a picture of a royal officer leaning over to see about one of his loyal subjects. Oftentimes, when we talk about God, we always use these big terms and big images to describe God. He sits up high and he looks low. He rules and super rules the world. He has the world in the palm of his hand. But David here paints a softer side of God. He said he's just not a God that's up there, but he's a God that's willing to come down here. Aren't you glad that when there are times when you can't reach up to God, God will reach down to you? Who am I talking to that can testify? There have been times when you've been too weak, you've been too depressed, you've been too despondent, where you couldn't reach up to God. But thanks be to God that God was loving enough to reach down to you. He said he inclined his ear to me. Life has a way of draining you and I. And if you've never been drained, just keep going to bed at night, getting up in the morning. Life has a way of pulling sometimes the best out of us. There are moments where we can't always shout to God. And then there are other times all we have is whispers. But then there are other times all we have is tears. Have you been there before? You couldn't quite put it into words what you were feeling, but all you had was tears. I can recall when my baby girl Genesis was a baby, her mother left her with me. And that's always a dangerous thing. And Genesis began to cry. And one thing all daddies know is something different about when that baby girl is crying. I tried to do everything to console her. I tried to get a bottle, tried to get toys, tried to carry her. And we all know that when babies cry, their tears are an expression that something is wrong. She was unconsolable. I couldn't quite figure it out. It left me frustrated, left me feeling less than a dad. But the good news is this: God is a better father than I am. When God looks at us, God does not have to ask a battery of questions. God can look at us and he knows how to interpret our tears. He knows when there's frustration. He knows when there's marital duress. He knows when there's financial struggles. That's why the psalmist says, there's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. Jesus knows all about our struggles. Can I give you something else today, church? Not only does God come close to us, but God rescues us. Look at the text. He says, and he brought me up out of a pit. This pit that David is in, it deserves our attention. This is more so metaphorically. Many believe this pit that David is in, this pit that individuals were thrown in, notice they were big wells with quicksand bottoms, and the more a person moved, the further they would go down. Isn't life like a pit sometimes? The more you move, the further you sink. The more you cry, it seems like things still are getting out of control. David said, I was in a pit. This is not a physical location, but more so this is a emotional designation. What pit is David in? Some believe that it was loneliness. David often found himself all by himself. Others believe it was his son Absalom who had gone rogue on him. Someone knows there's nothing like the struggle when someone you poured into, when they have turned their back on you. Some believe that it was King Saul, but listen, notice David does not put the emphasis on how grave of a condition he was in. The emphasis is on how great his saving was. He says, when nobody else would help me out of the pit, God did. Isn't that a good word for somebody? That when nobody else will come to your rescue, there is no pit, there's no situation that is too dark and too dangerous where God will not save you. Said he rescued me. He took me up out of the pit, and then he says he set me up on a rock. That's a good word. Whatever saving that God does in our lives, the word is to someone, God never does a partial job. When other people save you, they can put you back in a position of danger. But when the Lord saves you, whatever he does it completely. But notice it's just not a matter of security, but he says it's a matter of notoriety. He says he set me up on a rock. Sometimes God saves you so other people can see God's power. Can I push this for just a few minutes? Listen, stop thinking that God does what he does in your life is just about you. Listen, that's too small. That's too narrow. Listen, God doesn't save you so you can go back and tell your enemies, hi, look at me now. God doesn't save you so you can throw your nose up in the air. If it rains, you are drowned. No, God saves you so you can serve as a public service announcement to somebody else that says, look at the faithfulness of God. Look at somebody and say, neighbor, God does what he does. So his name is on the line. God says, I'm trying to use you to make my name big. But finally, and I'm done today, God inspires us. I like that. He says he put a new song in my mouth. Notice David concludes the first section of this psalm telling us what God has done for him emotionally. He puts a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in God. Listen, waiting on God is hard. Don't miss this. Alexander McLaren says, waiting on God, it weakens our flesh, but it strengthens our faith. I want to tell somebody, you waiting on God, it doesn't feel good, but maybe God is trying to make a better husband out of you. Maybe God is trying to make a better wife out of you. Maybe God is trying to make a better servant out of you. I know it doesn't feel good, but you got to learn how to hold on and look with expectation while you're waiting on God. David says this, I waited on God. God came close to me. He rescued me, but then he gave me a new song and put it in my mouth. But notice David steps back and looks retrospectively at what God has done. He analyzes the search and rescue of God's mission in his life, and he says this, I'm praising God based on what God has already done for me. You miss your point to get happy. Let me tell you, we live in this hyper church world where we're always getting excited about what God is about to do. He's about to open the door. He's about to make a way. He's about to enlarge my territory. But notice David doesn't shout on what God is about to do, but he says, I'm rejoicing on what God has already done. Can I ask you a question? When was the last time you stood still and looked in the rearview mirror of your life and said, I'm thanking God for what he's already done? He kept a roof over my head. That's what he's already done. He kept my marriage together. That's what he's already done. This is mature praise. If God doesn't do anything else, he's already done more than enough. And can I tell you, when you learn how to thank God for what he's already done, it opens the door for what he's about to do. David said, I'm praising God. Listen, the old village preacher says it like this, God brought him up, God stood him up, God tuned him up. God did all this because David possessed an unwavering trust in God. Listen, today, when you wait on God, you have to wait on God with some intentionality and a level of expectation. And then notice he says this, and he put a new song in my mouth. That's what I like about God. When we survive the waiting room, God has a way of inspiring us. And there's something about the believer who has survived the waiting room. God always has a way of putting something in their mouth. Let me put it like this. God puts a melody in your mouth for the lyrics that you've written in your heart. God has a way of giving you a song. Let me see if I can illustrate it. 1871, Horatio Spafford was ruined financially by a Chicago fire. 1873, his wife and they decided they were going to move to Europe with their family. While in the process of moving the family, he sent his wife and children on a ship headed to Europe, and the ship sank. His wife sent him this telegraph, and it read like this: saved alone. Literally interpreted, she was saying, your children have died, and I'm the only one who survived to tell you. Can you imagine how he had to feel? Depressed, overwhelmed, trying to start life over again, and the ship sank. He could have walked away from God. He could have said, enough is enough. But instead, he dipped his pen in an inkwell and he wrote the words to this song: when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Can I tell you something? When you learn how to wait on God, God will give you a song. Maybe that ain't your song, but maybe this is your song. I'm blessed in the city and I'm blessed in the fields. I'm blessed when I come and when I go. Maybe this is your song. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore, very deeply stained within. I was sinking to rise no more. But the master of the sea, he heard my despairing cry, and from the waters he lifted me. Now safe am I. When you wait on God, God will give you a song to the glory of God. We're praying together. Lord, thank you that you give us a faith that can survive the waiting room. Lord, someone is here today that they are in life's waiting room. It's challenging, it's hard, but give them a faith that can wait on you. And Lord, give them assurance when they wait on you that you are a God who will come close to them. You will rescue them. And then finally, God, you will inspire them. Move by your power. In Jesus' name we pray. And everybody said amen.